It is so good to be here today. I'm really excited to be able to first recognize and acknowledge that this Weaving Yesterday's project has been very generously funded by the California Humanities Foundation. This project includes what will ultimately be a beautiful new exhibit in our visitor center. This will be a historical timeline that's very interactive. And the goal of that timeline is to weave both the historical and cultural and ecological stories that make up the really wealthy, rich health history of the Elkhorn Slough. So we're very excited to be able to bring you along through this weaving of yesterdays and ultimately welcoming you to our new exhibit that we will be live streaming in December, a small ribbon cutting, and we will be sending out invitations to everyone for that. So again, big shout out to California Humanities for funding this incredible project. So what I'd like to do first is I want us to step back in time a little bit. I want us to step back to the 1970s. The 1970s in the Elkhorn Slough area was a time of big change. Not only around the world, but especially in this little place. There was an environmental movement that was taking place, a raising and awareness, if you will, of the value of certain ecosystems and certain beautiful places. The Elkhorn Slough, and I'll give you a little primer on the map if you've not been here before. It starts up here at the mouth of the slough. We have our beautiful 7 miles of the Elkhorn Slough that winds its way up here, and along the way you have beautiful salt marshes. In the 1970s, there was a small group of community activists who were seeing the potential development of this area. And there was a concerted effort to stop that construction, to stop the development, and protect this place for the future. This area was known as a migratory bird hotspot. So both state and national agencies were listening to this small group of community activists and beginning to understand better how valuable these rare estuaries are along the California coast. So with that, there was an effort to protect, and these changes began in, say, 1972, for example. First big changes. We'll come here to what is now the Elkhorn Slough Reserve lands. Back then, it was the Elkhorn Dairy. So these acreage here that you see on this area was part of that dairy. And you can see on our map some historical photographs, some historical barns. So the Elkhorn Dairy decided to close after 60 years of operation. At that particular time, the Nature Conservancy had been purchasing some of the lands along the edges of the Elkhorn Slough, and they were able to purchase the acreage that made up the dairy at that time and take it out of production. Several years later, 1979, the Department of Fish and Wildlife was finally able to actually purchase the land from the Nature Conservancy and establish the Elkhorn Slough Ecological Reserve. As you can imagine, a 60-year-old dairy was, there was a lot of infrastructure in place. So we had miles and miles of fencing. There were corrals and barns and residences, and all of this infrastructure included pastures, an amazing amount of pasture land to feed the cattle. So I'm actually going to have Ariel hold up a photograph, and hopefully you'll be able to get the lay of the land. In the middle of that photograph is what we fondly refer to as Hummingbird Island. But you can see in that picture, it is an island not surrounded by water, but an island surrounded by pasture. And so this is what the Department of Fish and Wildlife was met with. So we're going to go back to the big picture, thanks Ariel, and take a look at what was one of the very first restoration efforts the department undertook. So considering the historical flow of the water from the Elkhorn Slough into these beautiful fingers and tributaries, you could have seen in that picture that that area, which was all of this area in here, had been turned into pasture land. And that had been done with the diking and draining along the railroad. So with the diking and draining, the water was removed, pasture land was developed. So in 1979, 1980, the Department of Fish and Wildlife, again, first effort was to open a part of the levee here and return that historical flow back into these fingers, to return the slough waters back into these areas and increase the actual footprint of the slough and hopefully restore some of the historical salt marsh as well. Unfortunately, the engineering studies at that time indicated that over time that this area back here had subsided, which is a big word that means shrunk. So if you think about a sponge that dries up and shrinks over time, that's exactly what had happened here, but on a large scale. So in some places, the engineers measured that the level on this side was several feet lower than the main channel. The department knew that as they opened this, the water was going to rush up to the hillsides with no chance of developing any salt marsh habitat. So what was done in a very creative way were a series of false islands. And those of you who've been out here and walked the trail, you often see these straight lines, these islands that were created by, at that time by the engineers in order to create some habitat. Unfortunately, nature hates straight lines, and these islands have not lasted as long as the initial hope was for those, but some great lessons were learned, and we apply those now in some of our other restoration projects. So this is what was going on with the department here on site. About the same time, back in Washington, D.C., the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, was beginning to become more and more aware through the research that was being done of the value of these estuaries as incredibly critical habitat for fisheries, for birds, for a lot of diversity of species, and for humans as well, for food source. So these estuaries, through NOAA, they began a system called the National Estuarine Research Reserve System in the hopes to begin designating potentially threatened estuaries along the East Coast and eventually along all of the coastal United States. In 1980, the Elkhorn Slough Reserve, so again, our area here, our 1,700 acres of state ecological reserve, received that designation and became one of 3 estuaries that are designated in the state of California. With this designation began a 40-year partnership to this day of a state and a federal agency working to protect and preserve and to restore a very critical and very rare habitat along the California coast. So this partnership between a state and federal works great, but it worked even better because we have another partner here at this site, and that's the Elkhorn Slough Foundation. So the Elkhorn Slough Foundation has been a part of that vision for restoration and stewardship of the Elkhorn Slough from the very beginning. They were the public connection, bringing people out on walks, coordinating volunteers, until ultimately the state took on that responsibility, and the Elkhorn Slough Foundation moved into an accredited land trust. Today, the Elkhorn Slough Foundation is one of the largest landowners in the Elkhorn Slough watershed, and together with the reserve are working to conserve and protect the Elkhorn Slough through restoration, through stewardship, through education, and this collaboration has led to some amazing projects. So today we see projects that are taking place both in the watershed as well as on the reserve to remove invasive species, such as invasive eucalyptus trees, for example. Big restoration effort on both our organizations. There's also great efforts in removing past infrastructure, taking place through the reserve and on foundational lands. And together, again, we are working to conserve this jewel along the California coast. Some of those lessons learned, I'll share with you real quickly, is I'll go back to these false islands. So over time, these islands have eroded. And what we know is that, again, nature doesn't like these straight lines. So as the water comes in and out, it's pulling at these straight lines. And when you look at historical, natural, healthy marshes, they wind and they meander. And this allows water to move slowly through them and not pull away and cause erosion. So in the past 10 years, a number of grants have been written and a lot of research has been done, and an area was identified We've got a little yellow sticky here, and I'm going to move it up here. This right here is our Hester Marsh project. This area was identified as a marsh that had subsided over time, and the pickleweed and other native plants there were dying, were drowning. And so the question was, can we restore this? How can we restore this? What does it involve? And what it involved is a number of different organizations coming together to inform the science and the construction and the engineering of putting sediment down into a dying marsh and raising it up in order that it can be a sustainable marsh. And this project has proved so incredibly successful. Again, applying the lessons learned here and from other projects, that we've now moved on and have started what we call Hester Marsh Phase 2. And this part will now extend from 100 acres to another 100 acres of salt marsh restoration. And in doing so, what we're providing habitat for birds, for invertebrates, for the fish that are coming in and use these waterways, but also for the endangered California sea otter. So we know that the sea otters are coming in and using these marshes as nurseries, as feeding areas. It's a calm place for them to come into and rest and find food without the challenges of being out in the Pacific Ocean. So by increasing these salt marshes, we are providing greater habitat, greater healthy habitat to a whole diversity of species that call the Elkhorn Slough home. And this place is really remarkable. We refer to it as the jewel along the California coast, but it's also, it's a rare jewel because what we have along the California coast is a lot of rugged coastline. And so these estuaries that we have here are so rare that to be able to protect this and to be part of its restoration for generations to come is something that our collaborative partnership has allowed to happen and has really gone on to inspire so many people around the country in the efforts that they're making, as well as the visitors that come here. So thousands of visitors are coming every year to this place. School groups are coming and children are walking the trails and learning about the diversity here and learning to love this place. So it is that, again, what I love to call the power of partnership that has allowed this kind of effort to happen and allowed it to be so incredibly successful and nimble, if you will, and also sustainable. And we're committed to this beautiful place.
Another question that we do get very frequently, and I think it stems from the fact that we are this kind of unique category. We're a National Estuarine Research Reserve. So we're not a national monument or a state park. We're something entirely different. What are other National Estuarine Research Reserves that people could visit on the West Coast here?
Great question. So I think I mentioned earlier that the NOAA establishment of these National Estuarine Research Reserves started on the East Coast. So if you've been to the East Coast or seen images of the East Coast, you'll know that they've got these beautiful sand dune systems that go out into beautiful salt marshes all up and down the coast, pretty much from Maine to Florida. The West Coast is a little bit different. We're a rocky, craggy place, and so estuaries are very rare. So there are 29 total estuarine reserves that have been designated at this time, and that does include 2 on the Great Lakes, Alaska, and also Puerto Rico. But on the West Coast itself, if we start with Washington, there's one in Washington, that's the Padilla Bay. There's one in Oregon, which is South Slough. Both of those have visitor centers and have all kinds of research, education, and restoration programs. San Francisco Bay, not the entire bay, but 2 locations within San Francisco Bay have been designated the San Francisco Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve. Ourselves, and then you've got to travel all the way down to San Diego for the next estuarine reserve on the West Coast, and that is this Tijuana River National Estuarine Research Reserve. What's really unique about this one, and I would say that if you're traveling and you get down to San Diego, by all means to go visit. Beautiful visitor center. And what's really unique about this is that the Tijuana River moves from Mexico into California and then out into the ocean. So this is the only National Estuarine Research Reserve where we actually are collaborating and working on a daily basis with a foreign country, with Mexico. One thing I didn't point out, and I'd love to point out about the estuarine, the National Estuarine Research Reserve system, is that in every single case, the site was first and is managed by a state agency. So for example, the Department of Fish and Wildlife owns and manages the Elkhorn Slough Reserve. We receive funding and support and guidance from NOAA. In San Diego, the land is actually owned by state parks, and again, with partnerships with NOAA. And with San Francisco, it's actually with San Francisco State University. So in every instance, there's first and primary a state partner that is owning and managing the lands on that day-to-day basis. And then it's NOAA that does the funding of the projects and the work that's being done there. So I hope that helps.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, but I thought maybe you could close us out, Virginia, with just a couple of maybe remarks on your time here, and what you find as a positive of having these partnerships for conservation.
Yeah. I feel like, well, to back up, so I've actually been here at the reserve for 10 years. I worked first in a different capacity with our coastal training program, and now as the education coordinator for the past 5 years. And it has been a pleasure from day one. I am absolutely enamored with salt marshes because I grew up on the East Coast, so it's something very close to my heart. So being able to drive into the Elkhorn Slough Reserve 5 days a week is actually a gift that I feel very thankful for. And the ability to, as the education coordinator, tell that story over and over and over again, either myself or through the incredible team that I have that works with me. Again, I feel incredibly lucky. I talk about partnership all the time. Almost every PowerPoint presentation I do, I start with the idea of partnerships. And I see that throughout everything we do here. So it's not just these higher level partners, a state and a federal agency with a nonprofit. I see it on a day-to-day basis, and that really is the telling of how well we do things here. So the stories that I tell, they are given to me by the research team, or they're given to me by the stewardship team. They're out working the lands, they're out studying and doing the data collection. And it's those stories that as an education coordinator with, again, an incredible team of educators, we're able then to share with the public. So that internal partnership that goes on here is incredibly valuable. And I'm amazed every single day, just the collaboration and the teamwork that takes place here. And again, all with the goal in mind of preserving the Elkhorn Slough for future generations to enjoy. So again, thank you so much for joining us today. It's wonderful to be able to talk to the public again. We've missed talking to all of you, and we are, just again, super feel blessed to have all of your support.